Eddie to say he had to show him what to play and had to teach him all those songs, that is the biggest line of bullshit I've ever heard in.
For decades, Michael Anthony was a quiet man standing just behind the spotlight in one of the most famous rock bands in history. While Van Halen became known for wild energy, loud personalities, and unforgettable guitar solos, Michael remained calm, respectful, and loyal. He never chased attention, never demanded credit, and never spoke badly about his bandmates in public. Fans often saw him smiling on stage, singing those powerful high harmonies, holding the music together without ever trying to steal the show. To the outside world, it looked like harmony. But behind the scenes, a very different story was slowly unfolding. A story filled with silence, pressure, contracts, and emotional wounds that would take decades to surface. For a long time, Michael Anthony chose not to speak about it. Not because nothing happened, but because he believed loyalty mattered more than his own pain. However, silence can only last so long. At 70 years old, Michael finally began to open up, not with anger, but with honesty, about what really happened inside Van Halen, and how the band he helped build slowly pushed him aside. Michael Anthony was never the loudest voice in the room, and that was by choice. From the beginning of his career, he believed that music came first, not ego. While other members of Van Halen became famous for their strong personalities, Michael focused on being reliable. He showed up on time, learned his part, supported the band, and stayed out of conflicts. Many fans did not realize how important his role truly was. His bass playing gave the songs their foundation, but even more important were his vocals. Those high, clean harmonies became a signature part of Van Halen's sound. Without them, many of the band's biggest hits would not feel the same. Yet despite his importance, Michael rarely received public praise. Over time, his quiet nature made him almost invisible, especially in a band where control and credit slowly became everything. As Van Halen's fame grew, so did the power struggles inside the band. What started as a group of young musicians chasing a dream slowly turned into a business controlled by a few key people. Michael, who believed the band was a brotherhood, trusted the people around him. He did not question contracts. He did not fight over money. He assumed fairness would naturally exist between people who had shared stages, studios, and years of hard work together. That trust would later cost him dearly. While others protected their interests, Michael stayed silent, believing that loyalty would protect him in return. Unfortunately, the music industry does not always reward loyalty. Sometimes it punishes it. The public image of Van Halen was one of success, unity, and rock and roll freedom. Behind that image, however, decisions were being made without Michael's voice truly being heard. He was included in performances, tours, and recordings, but excluded from real power. Over time, that imbalance grew more painful. Michael watched as control shifted completely into the hands of the Van Halen brothers, Eddie and Alex. They controlled the business, the money, and the future of the band. Michael was no longer an equal partner. He was a contributor who could be replaced. Still, he stayed, not because he was weak, but because he loved the music and the fans. He believed that keeping the peace was more important than fighting for himself. This long silence shaped Michael Anthony's legacy. To some, he appeared passive. To others, he seemed unbothered. But inside, he carried years of disappointment, confusion, and hurt. He watched his role shrink while his contributions were slowly rewritten or ignored. Even so, he refused to attack Eddie Van Halen publicly. Even when Eddie made comments that hurt him deeply, Michael chose restraint over revenge. Only later in life did he begin to explain that his silence was never approval. It was survival. And now, with time past and nothing left to protect, Michael Anthony's story finally deserves to be heard, not as an attack, but as a truth that lived quietly for far too long. Michael Anthony's story does not begin with fame, money, or sold-out arenas. It begins in a simple home filled with music, discipline, and hard work. Born on June 20th, 1954 in Chicago, Illinois, Michael Anthony Sabolowski grew up in a working-class family where music was not a dream of stardom, but a part of everyday life. His father was a trumpet player who performed in local bands, and music was always playing in their house. From a young age, Michael learned that music required practice, patience, and respect. There were no shortcuts and no illusions about fame. This early environment shaped his personality. He did not grow up wanting to be a celebrity. He wanted to be a musician who could play well, support others, and earn a living doing something he loved. That mindset would follow him for the rest of his life, for better and for worse. Michael first learned music through the trumpet, not the bass. Playing the trumpet taught him control, tone, and listening skills. It also taught him how to blend with others rather than overpower them. These lessons would later define his role in Van Halen. In the mid-1960s, his family moved to Arcadia, California, and Michael had to adapt to a new environment. Music became his way of fitting in. He joined school bands, played sports, and slowly built confidence through performance. Unlike many future rock stars, Michael was not rebellious or attention-seeking. He was steady, reliable, and focused. Teachers and classmates knew him as someone who showed up and did the work. He didn't need to be pushed. He already understood responsibility. As he grew older, Michael switched from trumpet to bass guitar, an instrument that matched his personality perfectly. The bass is rarely the center of attention, but it is essential. It connects rhythm and melody, holding everything together. Michael embraced that role naturally. He practiced constantly, learned how to lock in with drums, and focused on making the band sound better as a whole. While others chased flashy techniques, Michael focused on feel, timing, and support. He also developed his singing voice, especially his ability to hit high harmonies. This combination of solid bass playing and strong vocals would later make him extremely valuable, even if that value was not always publicly recognized. In the early 1970s, Michael attended Pasadena City College, where his life changed forever. This was where he met Eddie and Alex Van Halen, two brothers already building a reputation as local music legends. At the time, they were performing under the name Mammoth, and their bassist had just left. They needed someone new, but not just anyone. They needed a musician who could play, sing, and commit fully. When Michael auditioned, he impressed them not only with his skill, but with his attitude. He listened, he learned quickly, he showed respect. Most importantly, he showed up prepared. In a world full of talented but unreliable musicians, Michael stood out. After just one rehearsal, the Van Halen brothers knew he was the missing piece. Michael officially joined the band in 1974, and the chemistry was immediate. Eddie's guitar playing was explosive and unpredictable. Alex's drumming was powerful and aggressive. David Lee Roth brought confidence, humor, and showmanship. Michael provided balance. His bass grounded the chaos, and his vocals lifted the sound. Together, they formed a lineup that felt complete. There was no sense of hierarchy at first. They were young, hungry, and focused on one goal, making it big. During these early years, Michael believed deeply in the idea of brotherhood. The band shared equipment, money, rides, and dreams. They played countless shows, often for little pay, slowly building a following. Michael never questioned his place. He felt equal. He felt trusted. He felt valued. That belief would stay with him long after reality began to change. And when success finally arrived, he would learn that the music industry rewards ambition and control far more than quiet loyalty. When Van Halen released their self-titled debut album in 1978, everything changed almost overnight. What had once been a struggling club band suddenly became a national sensation. The album captured raw energy, confidence, and a sound that felt new and dangerous. Songs like Running with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love, and Jamie's Crying dominated radio stations, while Eddie Van Halen's guitar solo eruption stunned musicians around the world. Critics and fans alike focused on Eddie's genius and David Lee Roth's wild stage presence. But hidden beneath the noise was another crucial element. Michael Anthony's bass and vocals quietly shaped the band's identity. His steady playing gave structure to Eddie's explosive guitar work, and his high harmonies added a soaring quality that made the songs feel bigger and more emotional. Without Michael, the sound would have been incomplete, even if many listeners did not realize it at the time as Van Halen's popularity grew. So did their touring schedule. The band played night after night, city after city, often under intense pressure. Life on the road was exhausting, chaotic, and full of temptation. Fame brought money, attention, and ego into the mix. For many bands, this is where cracks begin to form, and Van Halen was no exception. While David Lee Roth enjoyed the spotlight and Eddie focused deeply on his music, Michael stayed in the background. doing his job and avoiding conflict. He did not argue about song credits. He did not demand more attention in interviews. He believed that if he continued to deliver strong performances, his role would always be secure. To him, loyalty was not something you negotiated. It was something you lived by. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Van Halen released album after album, each one more successful than the last. They became one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Stadiums sold out. Records went platinum. The lifestyle became intense and unpredictable. Inside the band, personalities began to clash. David Lee Roth's desire to control the band's image and direction often conflicted with Eddie Van Halen's focus on music and perfection. Arguments became more frequent. Tension filled recording sessions and tours. During all of this, Michael tried to stay neutral. He often acted as a quiet bridge between band members, hoping to keep things from falling apart. He believed that compromise and patience could solve most problems. However, as the band grew more successful, business decisions started to matter more than relationships. Managers, lawyers, and contracts became part of everyday life. For Eddie and Alex Van Halen, this meant taking tighter control over finances and decision-making. Michael trusted them completely. He did not read every contract closely. He did not bring in his own lawyers. He assumed that fairness was automatic between people who had built something together from nothing. This trust, rooted in years of shared struggle, would later turn into one of the biggest mistakes of his career. Despite the growing tension, Michael continued to perform at a high level. His vocals became even more important during live shows, where his harmonies added power and emotion to the music. Fans who attended concerts could hear how much his voice mattered, even if album covers and interviews did not reflect it. Still, recognition within the band did not match his contributions. Decisions were increasingly made without his input. He was informed, not consulted, included, but not truly equal. At the time, Michael chose not to see this as a warning sign. He believed that speaking up might make things worse. Silence felt safer than conflict. By the time Van Halen reached the peak of their success with the album 1984, the internal balance of the band had shifted completely. The group was no longer just four musicians. It was a powerful brand, and control of that brand mattered more than ever. For Michael Anthony, this period marked the beginning of a slow and painful realization. Loyalty alone was not enough to protect his place. The band he believed was a family was becoming something else entirely. And soon he would be forced to make a decision that would change his life forever. By 1984, Van Halen stood at the absolute peak of their success. But beneath the surface, the band was deeply divided. The album 1984 was a massive commercial triumph, producing hit songs, selling millions of copies, and cementing Van Halen as one of the biggest rock bands in the world. To fans, everything looked perfect. The music was louder, the shows were bigger, and the fame seemed endless. But inside the band, power had quietly shifted. Eddie and Alex Van Halen were no longer just musicians sharing a dream with their bandmates. They had become the central authority. They controlled the business, the finances, and the long-term decisions that would shape the band's future. Michael Anthony, who still believed in fairness and trust, did not realize how vulnerable his position had become. During the tour supporting 1984, Michael was called into a private meeting that would later become one of the most painful moments of his career. He was presented with legal documents and told that if he wanted to remain in Van Halen, he would need to sign them immediately. These documents required him to give up a significant portion of his future royalties, publishing rights, and merchandise income. Even more shocking, the agreement was retroactive, meaning it affected money he had already earned. The message was clear: sign the papers, or walk away from the band that had defined his life. Eddie and Alex were present, firm but silent, allowing management to deliver the ultimatum. For Michael, the experience felt less like a discussion and more like a trap. At that moment, Michael faced an impossible choice. Walking away would have meant losing his band, his career, and the music he loved. Staying meant accepting terms that stripped him of financial security and equality. Years later, Michael would admit that he felt cornered and outnumbered. He did not have the support, the legal guidance, or the emotional strength to fight back. So he signed. "I just signed it, and that was that," he later said. Those few words captured the weight of resignation he felt in that moment. The decision cost him millions of dollars, but at the time, he believed preserving the band mattered more than money. Michael told himself that sacrificing his rights would help keep peace within the group. He believed that if he stayed loyal and avoided conflict, relationships could still be repaired. This belief was deeply rooted in his personality. He had always chosen harmony over confrontation. However, what Michael did not realize was that once power is taken, it is rarely given back. The contract changed the way he was treated within the band. He was no longer seen as an equal partner. He was now someone who could be controlled, replaced, or ignored. Shortly after, the band experienced another major shift when David Lee Roth left Van Halen in 1985. Many fans believed this marked the end of the band. Instead, Sammy Hagar joined as a new lead singer, bringing fresh energy and helping Van Halen enter a new era of success. For Michael, the arrival of Hagar was a brief moment of relief. The two musicians connected easily, both on stage and off. Their voices blended naturally, restoring balance to the band's sound. During live performances, Michael and Sammy carried much of the vocal weight, allowing Eddie's guitar to shine freely. For a while, it felt like the band had found stability again. Behind the scenes, however, Michael's situation remained fragile. Control still rested entirely with the Van Halen brothers. Although Michael continued to record albums and tour, his voice and decisions was minimal. He was present, but not powerful. As years passed, his reduced role became more noticeable. He was still loyal, still professional, and still committed to the music, but the emotional cost of staying silent grew heavier. What once felt like a brotherhood now felt like a hierarchy. Michael had given up his rights in hopes of preserving peace, but instead, he found himself slowly fading into the background of the very band he helped build. The breaking point, though delayed, was becoming inevitable as the years moved forward into the 1990s. Michael Anthony remained with Van Halen, but the sense of unity he once felt was long gone. On the surface, the band was still successful. Albums sold well, tours attracted massive crowds, and the Van Halen name remained powerful. Yet inside, Michael increasingly felt like an outsider. His role was no longer secure or respected. While he continued to play bass and sing on recordings, his influence in creative and business matters had almost completely disappeared. Decisions were made without him, and conversations happened behind closed doors. Michael did not complain publicly. Instead, he focused on doing what he had always done best, showing up, playing well, and supporting the music. But the emotional distance between him and the Van Halen brothers continued to grow. After Sammy Hagar left the band in the mid-1990s, Van Halen entered a period of instability. There were short-lived reunions, failed projects, and constant changes in direction. To the public, these years felt confusing. To Michael, they felt unsettling. He was still officially a member of the band, but he was no longer treated as an essential part of it. He attended rehearsals and appeared in interviews, yet he sensed that his presence was tolerated rather than valued. The trust that once defined his relationship with Eddie and Alex was gone. What remained was obligation, habit, and a shared history that made separation difficult. During this time, rumors began to circulate that Michael was being quietly pushed out. Nothing was said openly, but subtle actions sent a clear message. He was excluded from important meetings and decisions about the band's future. Plans were made without his input. Invitations came late, if they came at all. For someone who had spent decades prioritizing loyalty, this slow erasure was deeply painful. Still, Michael did not lash out. He believed that responding with anger would only damage the legacy of the band and the music they had created together. Silence, once again, felt like the safest option. The true breaking point arrived in 2004, when Van Halen announced another reunion tour with Sammy Hagar. At first, the news felt hopeful. Fans were excited, and Michael believed this could be a chance to reconnect and heal old wounds. However, that hope quickly turned into humiliation. Michael was told that he could only participate in the tour if he agreed to even harsher terms than before. He would have to sign away any remaining rights connected to the Van Halen name and accept a drastically reduced salary. More painfully, he was informed that he would no longer be considered a full member of the band. He could play, But he did not belong. The message was clear and deeply hurtful. The man who had played on every Van Halen album since 1978, who had sung some of the band's most recognizable harmonies, was being reduced to a hired musician. Eddie reportedly told him that he was welcome to perform, but not as a true member. For Michael, this was a devastating realization. Years of loyalty had not protected him. Silence had not earned him respect. He was being asked to accept a role that erased his history and contribution. Despite having every reason to walk away, Michael chose to stay for the 2004 tour. His decision was not driven by money or ego, but by the fans. He believed they deserved to hear the music performed by the people who had helped create it. "I just wanted to do it for the people who still cared," he later explained. On stage, he delivered professional performances, smiling through the pain. Off stage, the environment was tense and uncomfortable. Eddie's struggles with addiction and health issues made the tour emotionally exhausting. What was supposed to be a celebration of Van Halen's legacy instead exposed how broken the band had become. When the tour ended, there were no heartfelt goodbyes or plans for the future. Michael walked away quietly, knowing something had ended for good. The bond he once shared with Eddie was gone. The band that had once felt like family had become a source of lasting pain. This time, there was no hope of repair. Silence could no longer protect him, and the cost of loyalty had finally become clear. After the collapse of the 2004 reunion tour, Michael Anthony stepped away from Van Halen for good, choosing peace over continued conflict. For the first time in decades, he was no longer tied to a band that had caused him constant emotional strain. While Van Halen once again dissolved into uncertainty, Michael focused on rebuilding his life on his own terms. He did not rush into interviews or public statements. Instead, he returned to what had always grounded him, making music for the joy of it. Reuniting with Sammy Hagar, he joined projects like the Wabaritas Planet Us, and later the supergroup Chickenfoot, alongside guitarist Joe Satriani and drummer Chad Smith. These collaborations reminded Michael what it felt like to be respected as a musician and a person. In these bands, his contributions were welcomed, his voice mattered, and his experience was valued. Away from the toxic environment that had defined his final years in Van Halen, Michael rediscovered his confidence. He played freely, laughed on stage, and connected with fans without the weight of old conflicts hanging over him. For many fans, seeing Michael thrive outside of Van Halen was proof that his talent had never been the issue. He was still the same reliable bassist and powerful vocalist. Only now he was surrounded by people who treated him as an equal. Yet even as he moved forward, the past continued to follow him. Decades of loyalty and silence could not be erased overnight, and the wounds left by his departure from Van Halen were still open. In early 2006, Michael experienced what he would later describe as the most painful moment of all. Eddie Van Halen announced that his son, Wolfgang Van Halen, would replace Michael as the band's bassist. The news itself was shocking, but what hurt the most was how Michael found out. There was no phone call, no private conversation, and no sign of respect. Like millions of fans around the world, Michael learned about his replacement through the internet. "I wasn't even told," he said later. For a man who had devoted more than 30 years of his life to Van Halen, this felt like the final betrayal. There was no acknowledgement of his contributions, no thank you, and no goodbye. Eddie publicly described the new lineup as a reunion and a return to the band's original spirit. To Michael, this was deeply painful. In his eyes, it was not a reunion but a revision of history. The band was moving forward as if he had never existed. Communication between Michael and the Van Halen brothers completely stopped. Years of unspoken tension hardened into silence. What had once been friendship was now distance. Adding to the hurt, Eddie began making comments in interviews that diminished Michael's role in the band. He claimed that Michael needed to be taught how to play bass and suggested that his contributions were minimal. These statements shocked many fans who understood how essential Michael had been to the band's sound. For Michael, hearing these comments was devastating. He had been present for every album, every tour, and every rehearsal during Van Halen's rise. He had stood beside Eddie night after night, harmonizing and supporting the music. To have his abilities questioned publicly felt like a personal attack. In a rare moment of frustration, Michael finally responded, calling the claim the biggest lie he had ever heard. Even then, he avoided insults and refused to escalate the conflict. He did not want to turn a painful history into a public feud. Instead, he chose restraint, believing that bitterness would only cause more harm. Despite the hurt, Michael continued touring and playing music with dignity. He smiled for fans, avoided gossip, and focused on the future. His silence was not weakness. It was a decision to protect his peace. Still, the emotional weight of being erased from the band he helped build was heavy. The music world moved on, but for Michael, the story of Van Halen was unfinished. He carried unanswered questions, unresolved feelings, and a quiet grief of friendship that had ended without closure. That silence, once chosen freely, had now become a burden he could no longer ignore. When Eddie Van Halen passed away in October 2020 after a long and private battle with cancer, the news shook the music world. Fans, musicians, and critics mourned the loss of guitarists who had changed rock music forever. For Michael Anthony, the loss carried a deeper and more complicated pain. It was not just the death of a legendary musician, but the end of any chance for reconciliation. Years of silence, unresolved tension, and unspoken words suddenly became permanent. In response to Eddie's passing, Michael posted just 3 words on Instagram. No words. Heartbroken. The simplicity of the message revealed the depth of his grief. Decades of loyalty, frustration, admiration, and regret were condensed into a single moment of public mourning. Despite everything that had happened between them, Michael had never stopped respecting Eddie's talent. He often spoke about Eddie as a musical genius whose creativity knew no limits. Even during the most painful periods of their relationship,